What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Swordhaven, Iron Conspiracy, an indie CRPG that released last December in what I would describe, and the developers themselves described, as a bit of an unfinished state. But having received its final major update, it was finally time to take a look at this game. Now, I'm sure plenty of people have heard my spiel about 100% reviews and everything, and there's a video linked down below about it, as well as my Steam profile being public and linked below as well. But in the case of this game, with it being so long after release, people have already figured all of this stuff out, and in particular, if you have any questions about how to do something, I wanted to point people towards two Steam forum threads, actually, that were incredibly helpful for me personally, and answered every question I wound up having, and honestly made this whole process much faster. So credit to everybody in those conversations. They, again, were super helpful here. Next up, I did not receive a review key for this, but I did actually back the game on Kickstarter, which is where I got the copy of the game from. And then last but not least here, I do want to give a little bit of a spoiler warning. While I'm not going to necessarily go over a ton of major spoilers, there's a sort of big twist, if you will, towards the end, that if you see enough contextual footage of, you will easily probably figure out on your own. So keep that in mind. You may want to just listen to this instead, but either way, let's go ahead and get into the rest of it. So Swordhaven Iron Conspiracy was made by Atom Team. Atom Team is the people behind Atom RPG, and Atom RPG was their Fallout-inspired CRPG that was also an indie title, and while certainly rough around the edges, as you would probably expect with any indie CRPG, it had its genuinely great moments, which is why it picked up a decent following. And also why they are now kickstarting Atom RPG 2. But where Atom RPG was Fallout-inspired, Swordhaven was meant to be their Baldur's Gate-inspired game, and honestly the title probably should have told you that, given that Baldur's Gate also revolves around an iron conspiracy. Otherwise, this game has a few things going for it, I think, not least of which is the way it handles backgrounds. So in character creation, you'll pick a few different backgrounds, and they can have dramatic effects on how your character talks to people and the way the dialogue changes. Each of those backgrounds also comes with its own unique quest and the like. Even if it is relatively minimal actual content, it makes them feel bigger than they are, and yet that does still contend with a couple of issues. I will say straight away that I never got on with the combat of this game. I don't think it's the worst thing I've ever played or anything like that, but it is just not a system that I actually wound up enjoying, and it's mostly down to things like balance and the way everything ultimately works, which we'll talk about. Combine that with a low fantasy setting, and I can also see people sort of piecing out of this one before they actually finish, because it does take a significant amount of time for this one to really reel you in. But from there, let's go ahead and start digging in here, starting with the technical state of this one. Unfortunately, despite it being 6 months after the initial release, and also a whole bunch of fixes along the way, as you would expect, which, to be fair, did make the game run better than it did on launch, I did have a bit of an issue with this one crashing on me. In particular, when I loaded into random events on the world map, there was a decent chance that that would just crash the game sometimes, which got kind of annoying over time, as you would expect, but that was, thankfully, the only real issue I ran into, and because this isn't exactly a graphically demanding game, it at least loads back up pretty quickly. Now, let's talk about difficulty when you go to fire up a new game. Difficulty is an odd one in this particular title, because you can change it whenever, as you would probably expect from a game like this, but while difficulty, easy, normal, hard, and all that, does affect the usual stuff you would expect, increasing damage taken versus given, all that kind of thing. What it also does, however, is actually directly affect progression systems as well. On easier difficulties, you get more skill points alongside earning more experience, whereas on higher difficulties, you get less of those things. And when you combine that with being able to just swap the difficulty whenever you want, it leads to a situation where none of the difficulties really feel great, in my opinion, especially since the game tries to, I would say, insinuate that there might be non-combat solutions to things, and there often are. However, there's so much combat via things like random events and stuff that you cannot work your way around, that trying to build a purely socially focused character would be difficult, and you don't have enough skill points to spread them around to even try to do more than like 1 or 2 types of the social stuff it gives you, and that can mean you're tight on skill points, and even on easy difficulty where you have more skill points, it still doesn't feel like you get quite enough of them to be good at combat and also something else. And on hard mode, obviously those things are much more constrained, and then the beginning of the game doesn't see you getting all of your companions until a significant ways in, at which point, once you have all your companions, a lot of the difficulty goes away anyway, just on sheer numbers. So I wanted to take this difficulty section to just say that I don't think this game is balanced particularly well, and while I also don't think Atom RPG was a very balanced game, it at least had combat that was a bit more engaging, and building a combat-focused character, like for instance the sniper build that's popular in that game, was something that felt rewarding as a result. And here, you can pretty easily make a combat-focused character, like that's not hard to do, but it doesn't feel good to play one, especially when you're failing all of the social checks as a result because there's not enough skill points, and while it does use the party, like I said, you don't get those party members for a good ways into the game, which can itself be kind of annoying. So long story short, I think one of the game's shortcomings is ultimately that it could stand to be better balanced on that front. Either way though, now let's go ahead and talk about character creation. Now we do have a relatively modest, I would say, character creation in Swordhaven. But your first major choice is the background. There are 5 of these in total: Noble, Adventurer, Priest, which is what that wait a lot word actually means, Bandit, and Merchant. Each one of these does again get significantly different dialogue as well as the stats that they affect, but also they each get a unique quest on top of that. So this choice is actually more impactful than you would think, and while the exclusive quest, you could say, certainly add a little bit of replayability. Keep in mind you can still see everything. I actually found a little bit of confusion about the Kraken in-game, as it calls it, as the Merchant and the Bandit get led to a Kraken. The other guys can actually find that as well. You just have to hunt on the world map for it. But keep in mind there's a little bit of exclusive stuff. Next up, you have your attributes. For the most part, these do exactly what you would expect, and you can simply mouse over them to see what they do. They play roles in dialogue as well as affecting your actual stats, carry capacity, HP, that kind of stuff. More or less all of these are as expected. However, what I really want to mention is that the 4 points you get to spend here are really important. You can increase these attributes by finding an item throughout the game, but those are obviously few and far between, and so the attributes that you start the game with are going to have a significant impact on the things that are available to you, just in terms of like passing checks, and of course their knock-on effect of what they do for your skills. Skills could realistically be divided up into combat and non-combat skills. All of the combat ones are pretty self-explanatory. The higher it goes up to 199, the better that thing is. Your non-combat skills are a little different. Several of them are main character only, which is the talking skills in particular. So if you want those to be raised, you do need to do those ones on your own, but the rest can be relegated to a companion. Otherwise, intimidation, persuasion, and bluff, haggling are all relatively self-explanatory. Outdoorsman is your ability to avoid encounters on the world map and the like. Stealth is also self-explanatory, but don't sleep on it. Stealth is at a high level extraordinarily useful in terms of getting around enemies, but keep in mind there are situations where you are going to be forced to fight, so I wouldn't bank on it entirely. Lockpicking is very helpful for extra loot. There are locked doors and chests everywhere. Pickpocketing, I only found relatively limited use for. Like, obviously it will also get you extra loot, but there were only a couple times where I found pickpocketing something to be like truly the most efficient solution to a problem. And then crafting and medicine. Medicine is all about, of course, healing up on your own, which is helpful if you don't want to be resting all of the time. And then crafting is going to allow you to modify and craft your own equipment, which can save you a good chunk of change if you find all of the parts for it. Otherwise, you'll have to buy those things. Then there are your distinctions. Distinctions are a positive for a negative type of thing. I will say, for me personally, all of the character creation distinctions were a little too back and forth for my taste. Like, these have significant disadvantages attached to them, and so keep that in mind if you want to actually grab any of these. And I did also want to mention you can pick up other types of distinctions while playing the game, which will have various effects. Like if you kill a bunch of people in a town, you might get labeled as a butcher, that kind of thing. It's also possible to pick up blessings and things from the shrines you'll discover around the world map as well, which will add distinctions. But then you have your abilities. So normally, on normal difficulty that is, you get one every other level. On easy, you get one every level. And you can then grab a combat ability based on your skill in a given weapon type, be that martial arts, ranged, or the various swords and axes, that kind of thing. Then you can move on to the appearance customization side of this, obviously that is relatively limited given the type of game we are playing here, but it does exist if that's something you want to mess around with. And that is where the game starts, which brings us to the story setup and my thoughts on it. Now, the story setup for Swordhaven Iron Conspiracy is that an empire is exploring the island of Nova Draconia, a sort of frontier island that has yet to be tamed, which is why the empire is sending resources along with trying to sponsor their state religion there, which worships a big dragon god. On the way there, with your background determining why you are going there, there will be a shipwreck and you will be given an amulet that you are supposed to take to the game's main city, should you so choose. Obviously, you don't necessarily have to do that. And that is as good a time as any to mention that all the quest items and stuff can be sold, so keep an eye on that. But this amulet appears magical, and that is important because this is a low fantasy setting. Like, full-on magic is not really a thing here. Outside of one exception, we'll get to that in a bit, and that has to do with the, let's say, twist ending, which you may think by me pointing out there is a twist ending, you'll see what it is, but honestly, I doubt it. Either way, one of the main things this island is known for is its pale iron, known as Balta ore. This ore is special, you can't find it anywhere else, and it is incredibly useful for forging things, so there's a lot of value in this island on top of all of the other stuff. So it's probably no surprise then that there's a bit of a slave trade working around those mines. There's also strange happenings going on, beasts trying to claw their way into the world and other very odd things, from giant krakens met at sea, or giant blood-sucking bats that can also talk apparently, and plenty of other mysteries to go along with. But the goal really is to learn about this island and track down that main story thing. So that's what you need to know as a base. Now I'm going to take the rest of this story section to just outright lay out what this spoiler is because I want to talk about it for a minute. And so if you don't want to hear this part, by all means go ahead and skip past it because the rest of the story section is going to be a spoiler. So I mentioned there was an interesting twist. What is it? Well, the simple answer is that Swordhaven, or, Nova Draconia, this island, as well as the entire world which you are on, is actually a planet out in outer space that other people have found and colonized, actually. Another civilization of human beings has traveled here via space and has been here for roughly the last 6 or so decades, committed to non-interference with the locals while they gather up this Balta ore, which has special properties they need to fight some unseen threat. They have a highly advanced level of technology to the point that anyone seeing it straight up thinks it is magic, which are where the rumors of all the magic and things are coming from. And that is certainly a twist. It's not where I thought I was going with it at first, because once you finally deliver the amulet, which takes a little bit, you run into a group of people calling themselves sorcerers, and they are leaning on the fact that sufficiently advanced technology looks like magic to uninformed people to pass off what they do as magic, albeit very privately because, again, the non-interference stuff. Which leads to then the rest of the story. And I thought it was an interesting place to take it at the very least. I admit I thought they were just going to go into like the discovery of magic around this ore or something. And so I didn't hate it, but I'd be lying if I said it lands all that well either. Now to take this a little bit farther even, the catch with the most recent update, the Cursed City, is that there is actually magic on the planet. It's incredibly rare, and you only get 3 little abilities at the end of the Cursed City storyline, which itself won't become available until the end of the game. And once you do that, you get a hold of 3 magical abilities that ultimately are kind of useless because in comparison to everything else you will have had to do to get to that point, they're not very strong. So all in all, I think the story was okay, but I didn't love it or anything if I'm being honest. Which brings us then to the progression systems. Progression is basically down to leveling up, increasing your skills and gear and your attributes and all that, alongside gathering up companions, and then some other types of progression, getting a ship and a house, that kind of stuff, alongside hidden bonuses and abilities. But at a base level, do quests, kill things, you'll get experience and level up. Upon leveling up, and this will vary a bit based on the difficulty you are playing on, you will get access to skill increases based on your intelligence score, and then you can of course get better at those things. And then on normal, every other level, you grab an ability point to put in where you want as well. However, it is possible possible to increase these things via other means. Normally, reading books, completing certain quests will give you increases. There are items that give you extra attribute points, even if they are rare. And so that's not your only option. The other side of that being gear. There are various tiers of gear that you will be applying to yourself, and this is going to adjust things like a damage threshold, your ability to dodge or parry, and just general armor stats, that kind of thing, the damage mitigation you would expect. And then also you can of course raise skills, and some of these even have different effects like knockdowns and things on certain weapons. Pretty standard gear progression, if anything. Now, I would also say that companions play a role in progression as well, because once you have a full roster, it's actually much easier of a game after that point. Now, several of the companions are missable, and the first companion you get does vary based on the background you picked. After that, you get a temporary companion as part of the storyline in the first area you go to, Clamreach. You get the second one as part of being captured and thrown into a slave camp as you leave that area, and then the next two are missable based on how you complete quests. You can free a bard, actually, who has been falsely accused of murder in the next town over, Grainhold, who can join you. And then if you complete a quest just so in Swordhaven, right as you get there, you can actually recruit a circus performer as well. I will say her recruitment is a little bit buggy. You do have to complete that quest just so. Otherwise, she will not join you, and I wound up just not taking her with you as a result. But I will say, the companions here, most of the work goes into recruiting them. After you have them, they will occasionally comment on things, and of course they all have their deal breakers and things they really don't like it if you do, but for the most part it's not a big deal. Now, there is some other types of progression. You do get a ship as part of the main story later on, which is going to enable faster progression around the open sea, meaning you don't have to worry about crossing rivers, and you can actually buy a house as well if that's your thing, and that comes with its own bonuses as well. On top of all that stuff, it's mostly just the hidden things that I've already talked about a bit here and there, and that's kind of what we're looking at for progression. Honestly, very standard CRPG stuff, feels about as good as it should. But then we have the gameplay and world section. So this island is home to a few major settlements, those being Clamreach, Grainhold, and Swordhaven. Each of those is a town with quests and NPCs to meet. You do have to ask them for their name and things like that and kind of get stuck in on what they've got going on. And each one of them does a good job of feeling distinct. Clamreach is a fishing village, Grainhold is a farming place, and then Swordhaven is like your proper medieval city type area. Swordhaven is the biggest as it is the capital. It has multiple different districts and a sewer system, and there's a lot to explore there, and each of these places does genuinely feel different, which is nice. In order to get to any of those places though, you're going to have to traverse the world map at some point, and along the way you're going to have to deal with the mechanics therein, namely things like random encounters, but also provisions. So there are days passing in game, there's a whole day-night cycle and schedules for NPCs and stuff, but the thing you have to watch out for is using up provisions. You need to actually be able to eat in order to rest, and resting is one of your main sources of healing. If you get knocked unconscious in combat, the way to remove a wound is either through bandages or resting at an inn. Now, if you choose to rest at an inn, you can heal a wound and not have to worry about provisions, but that costs money, and doing it out in the world map requires those provisions, which means that's something you're going to want to keep an eye on, which is where other skills like cooking can come into play, as you can just use the meat you get from killing things, which is where random events and the game's hunting mechanic can come in, which is like a text event to find something to kill, basically, that you can trigger every so often. But there's also a merchant system. Merchants will buy and sell according to what they actually need. Like, for instance, the armor merchant is more likely to pay better for armor as opposed to things they don't necessarily sell, and that's something to keep in mind as you talk to merchants, as their prices will fluctuate a bit. You can also craft things, and all of that is while you work on learning about the Empire and what they're doing here, alongside the priests and everything that have come to convert the locals, colonialism style, and everything else. The world map also likes to use rivers as a bit of a blocker to progress, as you have to, in order to get across a river, pay a ferry at the associated settlement, and sometimes that's not always available right away, and you have to complete quests and stuff, and they use this as just sort of a gateway to progressing around the map itself. Now, beyond that, there are a whole host of locations and things to just discover and find, which have all sorts of little esoteric details and the like, that will see you doing things like learning about the natives, past civilizations, which is where the update with the Cursed City comes into play, and you'll experience all sorts of strange and interesting happenings along the way, making for a pretty decent CRPG exploration type experience if you're into older CRPGs. RPGs. I would say they definitely hit the highlights of those types of games, but it being a little less fantastical than most, it isn't exactly super compelling stuff either, but it's also a $20 indie CRPG, so there is that, I suppose. Moving on a little bit, next let's talk about combat. Combat is interesting in the sense that I don't really enjoy it in any of its iterations, but it is a toggle for real-time with pause or turn-based, whichever you should so choose. In both, however, you are effectively going to spend action points in order to act, and in real time there's also like a recovery time that comes into play, but for the most part use action points to take your action, whatever that might be. Now the catch here, and the thing I really don't enjoy about it, is a little complicated in the sense that initially at the beginning of the game it takes a while to get your companions. Honestly, probably a little too long, because the game is often throwing challenges and encounters at you that you should probably hold off on for a little bit until you have those companions. And so you wind up struggling, especially in the early game when you first play it, because of those reasons. Now, once you get past that, you start gathering up companions and just kind of winning fights through sheer numbers, you run into another problem. The game gives you all of those combat abilities, but there's not a ton of reason to use them in most situations because of their action point cost. Most of those abilities come at an increased action point cost. And when you are in turn-based, moving and attacking is surprisingly expensive on those action points, which means you'll be lucky if you can move and then attack, let alone use an ability. And then in real time, combat is moving so fast and everything tends to get really clumped up in both turn-based and real time with pause that there's a significant risk of you hitting your own people when you use some of these abilities. Like it'll hit everyone around you if you do like a whirlwind type attack, that kind of thing. And to me, it just really doesn't feel good because at the start, you get beaten just by sheer number again. Once you go through the trouble of getting all your companions, you win through sheer number. It doesn't ever feel like you're actually stopping to engage in the mechanics of any given fight. There were like maybe 2 fights across the game that gave me any sort of trouble. And honestly, none of it really feels interesting to engage with, which is, I think, really the cardinal sin here. A lot of it is just like very basic abilities. A lot of those abilities have those extra action point costs, which makes them difficult to use in the first place, assuming you're not playing in real time with pause mode anyway. But the vast majority of the time, the easiest thing to do was to just let the combat play out via auto attacks in real time with pause mode, because any attempt to do anything more tactical than that just usually wasn't worth the effort. So it's not the worst system I've ever messed around with or anything, but the combat of this game was really just not for me. Which then brings us to the Steam Deck side of things. So on the Steam Deck, it is in fact verified over there. It does play pretty well. Initially, they were dealing with some scaling text UI stuff, as I recall, but there are options to scale like the UI and whatnot, and that works on Steam Deck, and so it is verified over there. Relatively low requirements to play it as well, and thus, with the controller support, yes, it's a relatively easy game to play on the Steam Deck if that's what you want to do, which brings us to our positives and negatives. So on the positive side of things, I really love the options here, like, the backgrounds and the replayability of the exclusive content each of those backgrounds get, including just the way they talk to people and the way it handles dialogue. I enjoyed exploration well enough. I enjoyed sort of trial and erroring my way through quests in order to find different outcomes to the same thing based on the skills you have and stuff like that. And that's where I think this game shines the most. It's an interesting enough setup, it's an interesting enough game to explore, and they did a lot of fun stuff with, again, those options and the choices and the outcomes of individual areas, and then you get to see all that play out in your end slides towards the end, on top of a story twist that I have to admit wasn't exactly what I was expecting to happen by any means. But it does have some pretty big negatives, and for me, primarily the combat. I just really didn't enjoy the combat of this one. It's a little too all over the place. The conveyance of the mechanics, especially with things like, getting companions and how all of those guys are spaced out, and then the combat encounters you should actually be fighting versus the ones it gives you immediately upon reaching the first place that you should probably hold off on. And there's just a lot of user experience and balance there that I think could stand to be tightened up, and that's before you even start talking about the abilities and things. But it's my main gripe with this game. The other side of that, however, is actually kind of just quality of life stuff. There's a lot of areas where I think the quality of life just isn't there, which isn't surprising necessarily for an indie game. But to give a small example of a couple of things, when you enter a zone like a settlement area, it always puts you at the same entry point on the world map. And sometimes, due to the size of those maps, that's really far away, and the game has this little fast travel system of posts and stuff that normally works pretty well. So you get teleported to an odd spot, but you just walk up to the travel post thing and then teleport yourself to where you need to go. And it's just like, it's a little awkward, but not bad. But then you go to the main city. The main city is comprised of multiple districts. From the land, you can click on the main city and then pick which district to go to. But if you arrive via ship, you have to dock in the docks first and then go to the post again, which doesn't make any sense because you could just give me the district option while putting the boat at the dock and save me having to walk unnecessary steps here as I try to get to the thing. And the game is just riddled with little stuff like that, like little quality of life things that get to be annoying after a while. But honestly, small potatoes in comparison to the problems with combat I ran into. Either way though, all that brings me to my conclusion, which is that several months after the game's release, that is to say roughly 6 months in fact, given all the updates and the final major update that was added that added the Cursed City area, it finally feels like this game is where it realistically should have been when it released in December. And right now the game is selling for $25 US, and for that price you're getting a pretty good indie RPG. Not the best I've ever played, certainly not the worst, and while it will certainly appeal to the genre diehards like myself, for just about anyone else I would just ask yourself this question: how important is the combat to your experience with a game like this? Because if you're getting this game to engage with the combat, I would probably recommend you buy it on sale. But for everyone else, and the people who really just want to explore the island and get kind of stuck in the conversations and how all that stuff changes and the quest outcomes and the sort of just exploring a foreign land type of thing, then it's an enjoyable, recommendable experience, even if it launched in a pretty poor space. But that is where I'm ultimately going to leave this particular review, and to that end, I would love to hear what you guys think about this one down in the comment section below, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.